you very much. And I need to reciprocate because I'm a huge admirer of the programme here, and it's a pleasure to be able to come and talk to you, to meet you, and to spend the day with you. And it's also an extra pleasure because I'm asked to talk about working equids and the work that we've been doing over a period of about 8 years, much less than I am to talk about all the other types of work that we do over at the University of Bristol. And I really care about this work. And in particular, I care perhaps because although as I go through this talk, you'll sort of get a feeling for the scale of this issue, it's sort of hidden in a bizarre way because it's not front and centre of people's attention. And it's not the thing that I'm asked to talk about lots. So I love the fact that I can come here and talk to you about it and sort of just take you on a journey through my experiences of working in developing countries with working horses, donkeys and mules, and very importantly with their owners over a period of time. So what I'd like to do is introduce the topic to you. I mean, for some of you, you're probably not going to be too familiar with working equids and the different ways that they're used in the developing world. So I'll give you a bit of an introduction to them, and then I'll take you through some of the research that we've done. And hopefully, at the end of it, it will have inspired a few questions and some points of discussion, and then we can have a good chat. So I'm going to start by talking about people. The sort of underpinning problem that we're dealing with here is poverty in the human population. And just of course, you have to put some numbers on this. And there are well over 1,000 million people in the world who live in what's defined as absolute poverty, so who are living on less than $1 a day. And it's very difficult to work out quite what that means, but then we also have to add to that the fact that there's over half the world's population living on less than $2 a day, which is actually incomprehensible. It's enormous and massive and tragic. But what does that mean in terms of people's lives? Well, living in poverty does mean loss of dignity. People who are poor know they're poor. It's not a question of they've never seen anything else and have nothing to compare to. And when we look in the developing world at the moment, we often see countries that have mass divisions within them. So we have fast-growing wealth, which is creating a greater and greater divide between the rich and the poor. It also means that people are very vulnerable and that they don't have resilience to the challenges that can just be sprung on them at any moment in time. So we've seen over the past few years enormous changes in the strength of the dollar. The dollar itself has been knocked about. And when the dollar is knocked about in the US, it then has knock-on effects throughout the world economy. And a small change in the strength of the dollar can mean the difference between you being able to afford to buy food to have a meal in somewhere like Pakistan. We also see the effects of normal daily events, so heavy rainfall, that we sort of go and shut our way indoors and think, well, that wasn't very pleasant, can wash away people's homes, so it can have devastating effects on people. And we know other things. We know people in poverty are much more vulnerable to disease. We'll sleep. That doesn't sound good. Let's try that. And high levels of infant mortality, so there's tragedy, terrible human tragedy associated with poverty. And it also means that you're trapped. So it's difficult to find your way out of poverty. It's difficult to find that route that gives you opportunity, that gives your children opportunities to change their lives. So if you're too poor to access basic education, your children fall into the same trap that you have. Self-advocacy. People don't listen to you when you're poor. And in a lot of countries, doors are simply closed on you. The police won't even let you in to make a complaint about some injustice. So trying to sort of take apart what this word poverty means, it's very real and it's very harsh. And just to illustrate that picture I've had in the background was, this is Pakistan, this is in Lahore, and I was working in a field hospital, and when I opened the door of the wall surrounding the field hospital, I looked out over this sort of sea of very poor housing. But suddenly, overnight, it rained very hard, and I opened the door, and there was much less housing and some water buffalo taking advantage of the opportunity. But what you can see here is some happy buffalo, but this whole plain had people's homes on it the night before. They'd all just been washed away and they'd lost everything, which just illustrates how just, in the blink of an eye, things can change for people. So why am I wittering on about poverty? Because there's a huge relationship between what animals can offer to people who are poor and how important animals become. So there's a sort of interdependency which is very close and very real, and perhaps very fragile in a way that in our developed Western countries we're not nearly so conscious of. We know that livestock can often provide very, very important sources of food for impoverished families or families who've met with disaster. And perhaps one example was after the terrible earthquakes in Balakot in northwestern Pakistan, where there was huge amounts of devastation. One of the most important things that happened was that families were given chickens. Now, a chicken isn't that difficult to feed, and they're great scavengers, and they start producing eggs. Not too many eggs if they're not getting too much food, but it's a little bit of food and a very good source of nutrition. So it can make that one chicken can make a huge difference. And then we see that people have livestock, and the great thing about livestock is they tend to breed. So you can start to sort of develop programs where people have these animal assets that can stabilise and even begin to sort of increase local income. And a couple of years ago, I was doing some work with a British charity who were very interested in placing farm animals with communities in Africa. And they targeted communities who were particularly vulnerable. So ladies who had HIV or AIDS, and these ladies were able to sell milk from cows in order to pay for the taxi trip to pick up their antiretroviral drugs. So, and without which they simply couldn't do that. So it can make small amounts of money, that small opportunity of maybe just one go can make a huge difference. But what I want to talk about today is traction animals. So these are really sort of small businesses. So a donkey and a cart offering a service to carry people's goods around and make deliveries can be an opportunity for a family to get some income, possibly just, take that one small step upwards to have a little bit of money and a little bit more access to opportunity and a little bit more dignity. And it represents the type of small business startup that people can reasonably look at and attempt to achieve. So the World Bank one of its sort of measures of progress in business startups is the cost of the business startup in relation to the average income per head of the population, so the per capita income. And my figures are slightly out of date, but as you know, Pakistan's been going through a particularly volatile time, so it's quite difficult to get more up-to-date figures. But the estimated per capita income across the whole of the population in Pakistan was just over $1,000. And in order to purchase a donkey, a cart, and a harness, so to set up that small traction animal business, you're looking at sort of between 7,000 and 34,000 Pakistani rupees. So up to 50% of the per capita income for a small business startup is thought to be a reasonable access to opportunity. Doesn't mean that these people don't have to go into debt. Doesn't mean that they're not experiencing a lot of hardship to pay off this debt. But it is opportunity, and it's often the sort of opportunity that they don't get in any other context. The FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, published a very important report, which I have to say was very much orchestrated and facilitated and underpinned by David Fraser here. And they emphasise the importance of animals in helping people out of poverty. And they believe that by improving the welfare of animals, they can help people secure livelihoods in developing countries. And it's such an important thing to actually come out and say out loud. And I hope that some of what I've said so far illustrates the ways in which that might work. The trouble is, of course, that there can be costs to animals living in the developing world. And those costs can be very high in terms of the welfare of the animals. So I'm just going to show you a short film clip. The sound wasn't very good, so I've turned the sound off. But what you have to imagine is this is India, and the only important instrument on a vehicle in India is the horn. So all the time you're watching it, imagine lots of tooting and beeping and going on in the background. Lots of fumes and diesel and quite a lot of shouting. So it's very common for these animals to actually be pulling extraordinarily heavy loads. So these are animals coming out of the grain markets. And I'm not good at estimating weights, but you can imagine actually the weight on the load like that. And they're working in these incredibly complicated environments, sort of navigating their way through traffic that frankly has no respect for anything. And that includes life from horses. And often the animals and the owners don't have very good quality vehicles and materials. So just things like maintaining wheel bearings could make a difference to how easy or difficult it is to pull a cart. And another type of working equine is involved in is pack carrying. So these donks here are being used in the building industry. Can you imagine how heavy those packs are? That's damp sand. And one of the characteristics of these guys is once they learn a route, they'll just go backwards and forwards all day and you barely have to steer them. So here they go. And they're also sort of working in areas where it's very difficult to get vehicles. And they're taking the sand right into the house where the work is being done. So I hope illustrates in part sort of the complexity of the environment and the different types of work that these animals do and actually how extraordinary they are. Just to tell you a little story about donkeys, there was a huge problem between the Afghan and Pakistan border where for some reason huge numbers of donkeys kept appearing and collecting on the Pakistan side of the Khyber Pass. And what was happening is that the drug producers and marketers were loading up donkeys with drugs that they wanted to transport into Pakistan and setting these donkeys up, having taught them the route. So these donkeys were just steadily making their way over the Khyber Pass with no one driving them. So they were turning up in Pakistan and somewhere being intercepted and offloaded and just staying in Pakistan wondering what they were supposed to do next. So it sort of illustrates this wonderful kind of heartedness of donkeys and how awfully they can be abused for nefarious activities. So just a few pictures again to tell you more about the lives of working animals and some of the problems they face. So I've already illustrated it in the video. I mean, they work in traffic, which is actually absolutely extraordinary and overwhelming and very loud and very confusing. Unfortunately, accidents are very common. So we have animals who it's not uncommon for them to slip on the tarmac roads and fall over. And this isn't my slide, this was one that I was sent, so I'm pleased to say I wasn't there when this happened. Though it is quite common to be out in the streets and hear a crash and see a horse lying on its side and everyone trying to figure out how to get it up again. So they are vulnerable to traumatic accidents. And this is a picture that I took in Kenya, and donkeys are very much sort of, they live and roam around in the community and they're again used for particularly pulling carts and transport. And what's extraordinary about this picture is if you look at every little boy, he has a stick in his hand and off he's going after a donkey, and the donkey may well have been minding his own business and the little boy comes like this one, romping up, ready with his stick to do something to this donkey. And what's actually happening is the kids don't have anything to do, they don't have toys, they don't have ways of occupying their time, and it's become very much normal for them just to sort of pester the donkeys and annoy the donkeys all the time. And I have lots of sympathy for the children, But when we try and work with these donkeys, they spend all their time sort of wondering who's coming and what's going to happen next, and they're very difficult to deal with and handle. And of course the consequence of that is for their owners get harsh and you get locked into a cycle which is quite difficult to break. And this lady is what's known as a tonga horse. So she was a friend of mine. I met her in Pakistan, and she's come to the end of her life. So she's been pulling a tonga cart, which is a taxi for humans. You may have seen them with the big yellow wheels. And the hospital here we could discuss the ethics and the reasons for it, but they had a policy that when an owner had agreed that it was time for euthanasia, that they would wait for 3 days. So there she was put in a screen field possibly for the first time in her life and just given lucerne to eat. And every morning I was sort of going in panic thinking, oh no, she's going to be colicking, and instead of giving her a sort of dignified death at the right moment, she's going to be in a terrible state. But actually she spent 3 days munching lucerne and was put to sleep. But it sort of illustrates, you look from a distance and you can see problems with these animals and you can sort of get a feeling for the hardship they live through. And then you look closely, and the more closely you look, the more you see, which I think is where we come in, and sort of trying to look in detail and understand more about their lives. And we're also interested in what their behaviour tells us. And I found this picture, which I've been hunting for ages while I was putting this talk together. And anyone who knows how horses drink, horses are real faffords when they drink, and they kind of whiffle their nose over the top of the water, and they make a fuss, and they have a little slurp, and then they look around and check everything's okay, and they faff around when they drink. And then you see a horse that pulls up at a drinking trough and just immerses its nose into the water and just goes. And we look at that, and it's not a behaviour. I don't even understand what that behaviour is about, because it can't even breathe its nostrils under the water as well. So we also are sort of interested in the impact this has on their behaviour and what their behaviours mean. So it's a little bit of a tour maybe of some of the things that I've seen, some of the things I'm concerned about, and some of the things I think about. But I have a sort of a truism of my own, which is we have to remember that where people are living hard lives, animals do too. So it's very easy to look at some of the pictures and listen to what I'm saying, and we're very shocked and very judgmental of the people who keep these animals. But there is no doubt that they live very difficult lives too. And these two pictures are from a brick kiln outside Delhi. And this lady here is making bricks by hand in a mould, and she'll be doing that all day, every day. And linked to this is this mule here who's taking air-dried bricks into the kiln. Now, there's a number of people in the process of making bricks. And so there's the lady who makes, and then some lads who dig up clay, and people who stack them, and the guys who put them in the kiln. And they sort of work as a unit to produce bricks. And between that unit, which involves 5 or 6 people, in a day they'll earn about 50p, the equivalent of. So those 5 people somehow have to share that money out between them. So you sort of get a feel for the hardship that the people involved in this are experiencing too. So just to move on to where we fit in this. As David said, we've done a lot of work with a working equine charity called the Brook, formerly the Brook Hospital for Animals. And they've been carrying out interventions in areas of the world where there are working equines in extreme poverty for quite a long time. And they started to wonder what kind of impact they were having and whether they were targeting the right things, which is where we started to work with them. So we thought, okay, well, perhaps the first thing to do is to sort of understand what the welfare situation is for working horses, donkeys, and mules. So the first thing we did was what scientists do. We sort of looked at the population and where it is. And this is sort of my stylised map of where you find the most horses, donkeys, and mules. And you can see, of course, that the big populations are in sort of South America, Africa, and Asia. And in fact, the figures are quite extraordinary. There are sort of over 100 million equines in the developing world. And as that map showed, most of them are in Asia, Africa. What's interesting is the population appears to be increasing, and there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that as the price of fossil fuels increase, people who used to have kind of a little business, maybe driving one of the little tuk-tuk taxis or a little vehicle to deliver food or goods, have actually transferred over to owning working equids. And it appears that trend is continuing, and I can't see any reason why that's not going to continue. So we're likely to see increasing populations of equids and their increasing involvement in the traction industry. And it is amazing, over 95% of all donkeys in the world are found in developing countries, and the vast majority of these have been involved in the types of work I've been describing. And it was estimated quite a while ago, 1998, that 75% of all traction energy in the developing world comes from animals. So not just equines, so you also think about oxen and camels as well. But it's also likely that figure is increasing at the moment. So we know where the equines are, we know how many of them are, and then being a sort of good scientist, I went to have a look in the literature. And if you look at where the literature is focused, and you compare that with where the animals are, you can see we've got a bit of a problem, and a bit of disparity in knowledge, and it's not really surprising that very little is known about these working equines and their welfare, their veterinary needs, and the outcomes of any kinds of interventions that have been happening. So we thought, okay, this is a bit of a challenge. There are an awful lot of working horses in the world. They're owned by people from very, very culturally diverse societies, some societies that maybe are quite difficult to get access to. But we want to see if we can do a sort of find some way of gathering a picture of the welfare of these animals, just as a starting point to point us in the right direction. So we wanted to look at the animals themselves. So we wanted to sort of try and understand from the animals' point of view what their experience was. We wanted to start with this baseline measure so we know at this point in time what is the situation, what's going on with these animals, what's their welfare like, and that we hoped would allow us to think about the priorities for future work and help the charities to maybe target its resources and its work more effectively where it was most needed, and maybe reflect on where they'd already been working. And the idea was that this would start to inform a process where we could maybe start turning our attention to intervention type work. So understanding what was causing these high priority issues and then trying to target interventions to where there were high priority issues. So what we did was we sort of came up with these broad categories of things that we wanted to know about the welfare of these horses, donkeys and mules. So we looked at a few sort of behavioural criteria that seemed feasible and reasonable. So were they handleable? What sort of how responsive were they to the environment and people around them? How thin they were, so body conditions, were they fat or thin, that type of thing. What types of lesions did we see on their body, and where were they distributed around their bodies? What condition were their limbs in? Were they lame? And were there signs of systemic health problems, so disease and health abnormalities? So what we did was we came up with a checklist with about 32 different parameters on it. And you could actually carry out an assessment of a horse in 10 minutes. So it meant that we could ask an owner driving their horse if they would mind just pulling over to the side of the street, and we could carry out an assessment in 10 minutes, and then they could be back on their way again. So we weren't interrupting their living. So it's very important that we don't compromise their ability to earn money and feed their family that night. We also came up with a few strategies to try and standardise the assessment. So we used relatively few people, but But anyone who's worked across a range of different countries, every time you go there, they always want to add tweaks. And we were trying to keep our data very consistent across countries, so we set up an internet-based data capture system. So you could only enter data if it fitted with what we'd asked to be collected. And we did an awful lot of the data collection ourselves. So I'm just going to show you another video just before I show you some of the results. Just looking a little bit how you would, when you pull a horse over to the side of the road. So what we would do first is we would ask the owner if it's okay if we can look at the horse. Then we'd stand away from the horse and make some behavioural observations. But what I just want to illustrate with this video is actually perhaps a little bit how it feels when you look carefully over an animal. So you can see that this is an animal that's breathing quite deeply, its head is nodding, and then we start to look. And from a distance you couldn't really see that, and then you look, and actually what's been happening is that this animal had an injury on its hock. The owner, who was very poor, had tried some chemical cautery on the wound, had a very bad adverse reaction to that. And then we sort of gradually look over the body, and the way the assessment is designed is actually that no part of the body is missed. But what often happens is, from a distance you don't see things, but as you look quite carefully, reveal themselves to you. So it's very important that you're able to look underneath the equipment that's attached and used around the animal. And all the time we're also looking at these behaviours. So this is a heat stress behaviour, where we've got deep breathing right down to the abdomen, high respiration rate and head moving. So I've just picked out a few examples of results here. And this is the first tranche of data collection we did. And we collected data in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Egypt and Jordan. And since this first round of data collection, the whole welfare assessment has sort of grown a life of its own and continued. And this first sort of round included about 4,000 odd horses, and the database is now up to 15,000 and spans about 15 countries. But here, just to give you a sort of a flavour of the information, we were looking at the sort of behavioural indicators of apathy and unresponsiveness. Now, it's very important for an animal that it maintains responsiveness and vigilance to what's going on around it. But around about 10% of the animals across the three species were showing these signs of total non-responsiveness. They sort of sunk right down into what you might call something like apathy. In terms of body condition score, 1 is very thin, 2 is thin. So these are the very thin end of the spectrum. And here we're seeing 70+% of all the animals in that very thin state, which I guess, having seen the pictures, you won't be surprised at. Heat stress. We didn't see a huge amount of heat stress, but it was surprising that we saw any at all, because this set of observations were carried out over the winter period. And even this level of heat stress is very serious. Heat stress occurs when the core body temperature goes above a safe maximum limit. So this is something that kind of needs immediate action to resolve in these animals, and they weren't getting it at the time. And skin lesions, just the example I've picked out, is the lesions under the girth strap. So this one sort of goes around the chest, just behind the elbows of the forelimbs. And the numbers you're seeing here are the percentage of animals who've got either full thickness skin lesions, or lesions that have also involved the deep tissues underneath the surface of the skin. So these aren't the lesions where just the hair has been rubbed off and the top surface of the skin is a little scuffed. These are the really unpleasant ones. And it is extremely disturbing to see that sort of 20% plus of animals have that sort of severe lesion just in one place on their body. And in terms of lameness, you can see from these data that from a very quick step assessment of lameness, we were able to see that in most cases 90% or more of the animals were showing some kind of gait abnormality that was indicative of lameness. And I'll come back to lameness in a little while. So it gives you a flavour of the types of data we were collecting, maybe sort of range of prevalence, as the range of amounts of these problems that we were seeing in these animals. So our intention was then to think, okay, so this maybe allows us to prioritise issues, maybe helps the group try to work out where it needs to target its resources. But of course there's a big step from knowing you've got a problem to being able to do something about a problem. So the next question that arose was, okay, so we've got some quite serious problems here. What exactly is it that we need to make a difference to in order to alleviate these problems? What are the risk factors that are needed to this problem? So just one example of some work that we did. So I apologise for the next picture, it's not pleasant. Winking at you there from under the donkey's tail. Was with donkeys carrying tourists in the ancient city of Petra in Jordan. So the donkeys tend to work right at the back end of the site, so they're there not really very legally, but they're there for the Bedouins who've been displaced from Petra when it was made into much more of an official tourist site to earn a living, because there wasn't a huge amount to do other than exploit the tourist trade around about Petra. And these donkeys carry tourists up 900 steps to a monument called the monastery at the far end of the site. And when this group of donkeys was assessed, one of the common problems that came up, which was very specific to this group of donkeys, were these very unpleasant lesions under the base of the tail. So I guess it's not just specific to this group of donkeys, but it was what this team who worked with these donkeys were very worried about. And intuitively, it's got to be something to do with the equipment that hangs around the tail of the donkey. And when you look at the types of equipment that were being used on these donkeys, you see quite a range of rump strap. You can't really call it a breech, and you can't really call it a crop. It's something sort of between the two. So you can see you've got this sort of cotton strapping, these maybe thinner straps. Sometimes there would be wire, sometimes there's string, or these much more sort of padded straps. Sometimes they would be fleece, so man-made fibres. Sometimes these are cotton. So there was quite a diverse range of these types of straps. But we also thought that's a bit of a limited way of trying to understand what's going on here, because it might be an interaction between the type of strap but also the way the donkey is being worked. So there are about 80 donkeys working on the steps in Petra, and we embarked on a project to follow and observe and take notes on what was happening with these donkeys for at least one trip all the way up and down the steps. Now, I can tell you, by the time we finished, I was like a racing snake. But the first week, I was hugely embarrassed, because by the time I got to the top of the 90 steps following these donkeys, I was just about on my knees. So what we did was we followed these donkeys up and down the steps. We took lots of observations of all the harnessing and fitting. We talked to the owners of the donkeys and sort of tried to get an understanding of we asked some basic things like, do you have any lesions? Do you have any worries? How do you manage your donkey? We talked to the tourists who were hiring the donkeys, often in sign language, because there were many different countries visiting the site at Petra. And we also sort of did home visits to observe how the donkeys were being managed. So the findings were really interesting and surprising, because they were completely counterintuitive to what I had been expecting. Because we found that the biggest risk for these lesions under the tail were to have big, padded cotton straps. So exactly the opposite of what I would have assumed, because you always think, when there's a lesion, our sort of instinct is to pad and protect and look after it. But what seems to happen in that particular situation is that these straps are so big, they're probably a bit too tight. They also accumulate dirt, often from the feces that are coming out of the anus around about the sort of base of the tail. They get hot and sweaty, then a bit of dust accumulates and it gets a bit abrasive, and you start to get a lesion, and then as soon as the lesion starts, this just makes it worse and worse, and there's no opportunity for it to heal. So it was very counterintuitive, and it was exactly the opposite to the advice that the veterinary teams of the group had been giving to the owners in Petra. So it really gave us a pause for thought. Sometimes, we can't just assume the obvious. There was also an interesting issue about tourist awareness of the problem. And we talked to a lot of tourists, and we talked to them about how and why they selected the donkey they rode. And in general, they had very little view about the donkeys that they rode. And what we eventually realised was that those people who had a view about the donkeys and their welfare and their care were sort of abdicating by not choosing to ride a donkey at all. And owner awareness was an issue. So very few owners were aware that their donkeys had these kind of lesions under their tails. But when they were aware of them, they were adding more and more padding. So they were actually exacerbating the problem. And the other sort of behavioural issue of the owners, which was linked to finding these lesions, was that they were much more likely to goad the donkeys. Now it's quite subtle because most tourists don't really like to be riding a donkey that's been hit on the bum with a stick up the steps. So the donkey boys often have kind of like a nail tucked in their hand, and they just go and sort of prodding the donkey as it goes up the steps. And of course that goading made the progress of the donkey up and down the steps very uneven, and that also seemed to be something that was contributing probably as a secondary problem to these lesions. So I'm just sort of illustrating the process of going from identifying and prioritising the problem to using science to try and understand what's going on and maybe what we should be advising and working with owners to do in order to sort of try and deal with that problem. But then there's an important question, isn't there? I've sort of talked about this intractable problem of poverty, and it's probably one of the questions that I'm asked more than any other, and that I've asked myself an awful lot is, how can we ask people, and how can people make a difference to animal welfare when they themselves live in terrible poverty? You know, are we really on hiding to nothing here? Is it actually possible to make a difference to the lives of these animals when there's so little resource available? So we decided to try and work out and sort of test this question to destruction. So we identified that we knew lameness was a high priority issue, but a very difficult issue to deal with. And we wanted to sort of test out whether we could run an intervention that would make any kind of difference to the levels of lameness experienced by working with horses, in this case in particular. So, as usual, we sort of went back to Becky 6 and we thought, right, we know that there's a lot of limping going on, but I don't really know anything about the pathologies, the causes of lameness that are going on here. I need to sort of understand more about what joints are affected, what diseases are causing lameness in these animals. And then maybe we can pick out one big one and target it, just to make our life a little bit less complicated. So we did a very detailed study of 217 working horses in India and Pakistan, and very detailed clinical observations of these animals. And the findings were just absolutely terrifying. Every single horse, when you look very carefully and you take your time, every single horse that was examined was lame. 98% of them were lame in all four limbs. So I was starting to get a bit nervous at this point and thinking, my goodness, what on earth are we going to do? And also, it wasn't as though the limb was associated with a single pathology, a single sort of disease process. We saw combinations of old problems, problems that were affecting the bones, problems that were affecting the tendons and the ligaments. We saw acute, hot inflammation, all going on in the legs at the same time. And a lot of the pathologies that we were looking at were associated with pain, just in terms of the way we were sort of assessing it in the clinical situation by palpating, touching and sort of flexing the limbs. So this was a bit of a disaster from the original plan, which was to pick one pathology and really focus on it. And it became apparent that the only way that we could work with this was at the whole horse level. And that also there was so little we could do in terms of a veterinary type intervention. It was all about working with the owner to change the way they use their horses, to see if that would. We weren't going to do anything about the chronic problems in these legs, but maybe reduce the amount of acute type the current information that we're seeing on these lakes. So what we did was we decided to work in Jaipur in India, and we went to 21 horse-owning communities, and we then matched them with 21 control communities. And these guys that you can see here in the corner looking quite chirpy were facilitators, so every community nominated someone from their own community who we trained to go through a series of sort of exercises to explore within their own community what lameness was all about. We explored the economics of working horses, we talked about their knowledge was gained about the management of horses, they talked about the underlying causes of lameness in horses. And what's very, very important that's revealed from this is they hold huge amounts of knowledge, and we often don't respect the knowledge and expertise that these animal owners have of their own situation and their own animals. We sort of tend to maybe have a slightly, well, the animal's lame so they can't know what they're doing. Or I think I'm certainly guilty of that, or I was at the start of this project. And we worked on gradually allowing the communities to explore their own knowledge and their own situations and make their own decisions about what they thought they could change. And we ran the project for a 2-year period. And I think that I have to sort of say at this stage, if you can imagine, even making the smallest change is an enormous risk. So in fact, working with the community to make their own decisions is much safer than trying to sort of impose an external change. So they're very much recognising what risks they can take and very closely evaluating the impact and drawing back from them. So it felt like we had to do this very gently and very safely so as not to sort of devastate people's livelihoods. And when I mean a risk, let me give you an example. So imagine that one of the things we discussed was about improving the quality of the rest that the animals had when they weren't working. So that was about maybe taking them out of the cart and harness, standing them in the shade and making sure they had a drink. The trouble is, if you take your animal out of the cart and the harness, the next time someone comes along to hire your cart, or to hire a cart from the bank of donkeys and carts or horses and carts that's waiting for work, you're going to miss out because you're over there with an unharnessed cart and they're just not even going to think about hiring you. So actually the risk of doing that is phenomenal. And the only way you can do that is if you work together as a group and agree to respect the order in which people put themselves forward to be hired, which is another reason why it has to work at a community level, not at an individual level, and it can't be imposed from outside. And what we did, our part in it, I guess, was to sort of facilitate that process, but also to carry out our assessments on behalf of horses' limbs to see what impact this was going to have. So we did the assessments right at the beginning of the project, after a year into the project, and at the end of the project, after 2 years. And we also did some exit interviewing with the owners, but the plans to sort of be able to track what they were doing during the course of the process unravelled slightly for many reasons, including trying to work in India when you live in England. But what we did was we sort of did lots of retrospective evaluation of what had changed negatively, what had changed positively, and the results of that were fascinating. And also asking them what they thought of the whole thing, and what they would like us to do next time, what they would like to do. And so the whole point of the exercise was to ask this question: can we make interventions? Can we make a change to the welfare of animals in a situation of poverty? And just before I tell you, just to give you a glimpse of our results, which we're still working on, I just want to show you the outcome of one of the exercises, because I think it's quite poignant. So this sort of illustrates how these community exercises work. So the community come together and they've got sort of cards that we provide, and they draw pictures and they sort of discuss issues, and it's illustrated by a picture. So it allows people who are literate access to the discussion, and it allows them to sort of rank and order and shuffle and consider the value or the risk or those types of things. So these are exercises that we use very commonly in human And I'm going to show you just a little slice of the results from an exercise that was done, where they were looking at how much money they had and how they prioritised what they would spend money on. So I'll talk you through this, but this is a sort of transcription of one of the exercises, which I think is a very powerful and, from my point of view, very poignant exercise. So what we ask the authors to do is we say, okay, so what are you going to spend money on? Rain, if you've got a limited amount of money, you have to make a choice. And they do this with matchsticks, and they point the matchstick in the direction of the priority, and I've just sort of adjusted it up to make it work on the slide. So in this case, this is an actual outcome of an exercise from the community. So you can see here that if you've got to make a choice between tea and coffee or getting grain to make bread and cook with, then they're going to get the staple food, which perhaps isn't surprising. And then we look at festivals and weddings. Now this is hugely important in the Hindu culture, but you can see here that, not surprisingly again, the staples, tea and coffee and grain to feed your family, are prioritised over attending festivals. But that causes a lot of angst. At that point there's an awful lot of discussion, because that's a pretty hard decision to make. I mean, not taking a present to a wedding is socially very unacceptable. So then we look at animal feed, and you can see here that animal feed is prioritised over tea and coffee and festivals, but they're making a choice here about whether to feed their animal or to feed themselves, and they're sort of having to choose to feed themselves. But again, imagine sitting down and discussing, making that choice. Then we look at clothes, so basic things that we'd probably buy every day and don't think about. And in all cases, everything is prioritised more highly than buying clothes. But unfortunately, the next one is about your education, paying fees to send your children to school. And here it gets really tough, because in every case, everything is prioritised over paying fees to send your children to school. Slightly, from our Western perspective, slightly alarmingly, festivals included in that. But it does illustrate how important festivals are in the culture. So the baby here is about getting emergency help in child delivery. And of course, that is prioritised absolutely over everything. And then this saddle illustrates buying and getting equipment, harnessing, those types of things repaired for your horse. And you can see that it's prioritised over tea, it's prioritised over clothes, it's prioritised over your children's education, which starts to sort of give you a feeling for how important this animal is in the scheme of things. And then there's actually a much longer list than this, but this is all I can fit on the slide. This one is the policeman, and this one's pretty poignant as well, because this is about, you get given on-the-spot fines, and they're usually fairly unjust. And if you're very low in the pecking order, you're very poor, the consequences of not paying a fine are very dire, and you get locked away, and you usually get beaten up. And so you can, people worry enormously about the consequences of getting a fine from the police. And you can see that it's prioritised over absolutely everything except getting medical help in the case of child delivery. What this illustrates is how tough the choices are that these people have to make, and that coming together as a community and discussing this is actually very powerful. It's very powerful of figuring out for them how they prioritise their animal and the needs of their animals when they've got limited resources to spend on them. So just to sort of round that off slightly, tantalising you because I haven't yet told you the results of the work. It is important to know that owners often talk about things like love in these cases. They're very, very fond and attached to their animals. And what I've just shown you sort of illustrates how complicated and harsh some of the decisions they have to make when they've got limited resources. We've talked about that already. But although the animals are very much dependent on their owners for resources and the decisions the owners make, the dependency is very much reciprocated because the owner is very dependent on the animal, and I think the matrix illustrates that to some extent. So I hope that sort of slightly illustrates the difficulty of the decisions these owners are going to have to make in order to do anything to try and reduce lameness in their animals. So the outcome of this is my one data slide. The blue bar represents our control communities, and the green bar represents our 21 intervention communities. And what we saw was, and the score here is an overall lameness score. So it's quite sensitive. It's based on a 10-point score of lameness. So and it's scoring all 4 limbs together. So it's an overall lameness score for each animal. So what we saw was the scores were about 5 across all the horses in the communities at the baseline at the start of the project, though the scores were slightly higher in our intervention community. But we then saw between, I'm just going crazy. We saw a significant decrease in that overall lameness score between our baseline year and year 1 that we didn't see in the control communities. So you do see a decrease in the control communities. We can talk about why that happens, and it's very common. And it might be that there is a shift going on in what's happening in Jaipur in terms of working equites anyway. But if you look at that, we're seeing sort of a shift from just an overall lameness score of 5 down to about 3. And then that shift was sustained into the year 3 of the project. So we weren't getting rid of lameness. We weren't suddenly making a transition to horses no longer limping out on the streets. But we saw a small reduction in the severity of lameness. And I think in the context of what we were trying to deal with, that's absolutely amazing. I don't know what impact it has on the welfare of the horses. I'd like to believe it at least had a small impact. But what it does illustrate is possible for people in very difficult situations to make adjustments that can make a difference to welfare. And interestingly, the other change that we saw coupled with this was a reduction in lip lesions in the horses. And that was a yes-no, so that was a total abolition of lip lesions in some of the horses, which when we traced it all back is because one of the changes they made was differences in the way they drove the animals. So I went on slightly longer than I said I would. I do apologise, got a bit carried away. Just to sort of, so I've sort of tried to take you on a little bit of a journey, we've been through with our research and the way we've approached moving from understanding the problem through to seeing whether there's anything we can do about it. But I think that this picture here, which is an Afghanistan horse on a ceremonial festival day, does show something about the sort of pride and relationship that many owners have in their animals. So when we work with animals, we really are, we're working with owners, but we're also, I hope, improving their lives as well. So much of the work that I've talked about, as David indicated, has been funded by Brook, which is a UK working equine charity. And I'm standing here presenting to you, but of course I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants. There are many people who over time have been involved in this sort of 8-year track of work that we've been doing. And of course, it's so important that, to acknowledge the vets, the staff, the field workers that we've been working with, but most particularly the owners of the horses and donkeys and mules that we've been dealing with. So I'll just leave you with a donkey having a bit of fun.
From the First World War and the horses and the English lady?
Yes.
And secondly, I became aware of the book by traveling British Airways. And I think that was fabulous. Because there was a...
Yes, a sort of international recognition of the importance of their work, absolutely. So the Brooke was started by a lady called Dorothy Brooke, and I think you may know this better than I do. She was the wife of the English ambassador who was in Egypt at the end of the First World War, and she became aware that many of the horses who'd been used during the war had been left in Egypt and just abandoned on the streets, and their welfare was absolutely appalling. So she established the Brooke, first of all in Egypt, to try and make a difference, to offer veterinary care to these animals that had sort of served their country and then been abandoned in Egypt. And so Egypt is very close to the heart of the Brooke, and it also opened up a very big question for us, because the Brooke were coming up to their 70th anniversary when we started working with them, and they said, we've been in Egypt for a long time, and we'd like to know where we've got to, which was very much one of the inspirations for starting the work with us.
About 30 years ago or more, I remember reading a report of an engineer who had been to Southeast Asia, and he came back saying he wasn't there to talk about how the cultivation was being done with animals, but he felt very sure the productivity of the farmer, and particularly of the water buffalo that they were using for tillage, could be greatly increased by an improvement in the harness, because what they were largely using was restricting the air intake, and he thought that a comparatively simple design would do it. He said, I am from a farm background, I know a little bit about how to get productivity out of draft animals. I wonder if anything ever changed following that.
That's a very good point, and it's also something that we still hear a lot, is if we could change this design, if we could just do something different, things would be a lot better. But it's really important to look at the genesis of why a harness has developed in the way it has. And I quite agree with you, often they look ridiculous and inappropriate, but they're very often born out of the available resources. And sometimes when we go and we try and make substantial changes, we find that you go back in 2 years' time and things have either reverted to how they were because it's the only way that they can produce harnessing with the resources that they've got available to them, or they haven't been able to maintain the adjustments, and actually we get sort of this hybrid harness which is even more harmful than the original one. So again, it's that sort of thing about taking care with interventions, that we're not imposing an external intervention, but working with the community to see where we can make small adjustments. But I think every single one of us who works in that context sort of thinks, why can't we just do this and it will make a huge difference? And it probably would, but we've got to keep an eye on sort of the long game, which is why I think for a very long time lots of people have been saying that. So you're very right in one sense, but also it's sort of about seeing whether you can sustain that change and whether it's going to really work for the community. But a really good point.
One or two visits does not make an expert.
No, very much so. Or even 8 years worth of visits. Sorry.
I was fascinated by the social science possibilities in the work you're doing, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about that. And two things struck me. One was the correlation between the improvement in the welfare of the animals, likely then their performance, and whether there was a way or metric or some way you could look at what happened to the people and whether there was a beneficial effect. Because if that was so, it would become very much more self-sustaining.
Absolutely, yes. We didn't exploit the social science opportunities to the full benefit, really, because we were running out of time and running out of resource, but I completely agree with you that it's sort of the missing part of the work that we've done. We tried to explore it within the confines that we could within our exit interview. And And I guess it also ties in with the wider issue that's very much becoming a part of animal welfare work, is that it is a fusion between natural science and social science. Because it's so much about working with people and understanding people's position on animal welfare, that I know that it's happening here in British Columbia and it's happening at Bristol, that we're very much engaging with social science in a way that perhaps even 5 years ago it wouldn't have been.
I just have an ancillary comment to that, which is if you look at that particular culture, you see a wide variety of maintenance schedules on road vehicles. And when you describe these animals as the providers of traction, it really struck me, you know, are they seen in the eyes of their owners as a vehicle or as a being?
That's a very good question. Those 21 communities were a mixture of Hindu and Muslim communities. And you do see some difference in perception between those two groups. And I don't actually know the answer to your question, but what we sort of tried to boil down with them was where they had affection and how they valued their animal. And I think often they see them much more as a utility than we do. I don't think they see them as a machine, but they get quite uncomfortable actually when they're forced to start thinking about them as a feeling being, and when we discuss pain, because they know that part of the reality of their lives is that they have to keep these animals going when they're suffering. So sometimes when we touch on those subjects, it can become a really uncomfortable conversation for them. And one of the things that we do, which perhaps maps onto your comment as well, is that I would like to mention is we never talk about increasing productivity of these animals, because most of them are absolutely on the edge anyway. And we might improve their welfare in order to increase their productivity, and then their welfare just dips again. So we often make the case with owners that it's about increasing their longevity, which, you know, I don't know how I feel about that, but from an owner's point of view, that security of having an animal over a period of time is a huge selling point. So we don't have to say to them, well, we have to work harder and put a bigger load. We just say, you know, we can secure it for a longer period of time, which also maybe sort of is another view on how they feel about these animals and where their dependency sits with them.
You said there was 105 million working equines in the world. What about the food supply?
For the equines?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, knocked about hugely by the available food. So when food is in short supply for humans, it's in short supply for animals. So oddly enough, in a place like Pakistan, the equines are also involved in the provision of food for equines. So there are some that work on farms and bring food into the fodder markets to be sold to the individual equine owners. But in a year where there's drought, then these animals get a much lower proportion of the available food, because they're then, especially in terms of sort of the higher protein options, they're competing with the humans for the same food resource. And there was a year of working in Pakistan when it was just terrible. It was a really hard year, and the animals were absolutely emaciated. So it gets pushed around, and they're just as vulnerable to sort of the vagaries of the season and the success of the agricultural year as the human population are.
Do they consume them when they die?
In Kenya, there's been a big push to encourage people to think of donkeys as a food resource, so that when they do die, they have this added value of being a food resource. And the reason for that push was because the women do an awful lot of the heavy work in Kenya. And so there's been a lot of encouraging them to use donkeys to lighten the load of women's work. But they had to also promote the fact that you could eat a donkey when it died in order to encourage the uptake of the donkey. So it's something that you see there as being acceptable, which it wouldn't happen in a place like Pakistan or Afghanistan. It would be acceptable.
North Americans eat horse meat. Why would they not eat it?
It's part of their where horses and donkeys sit within their sort of social within their priorities, and they're very low down, and they wouldn't need that.
Last question to Roland.
Sorry for I'm missing something from the graph, but then the graph when you show the control and intervention, you say that there's a significant decrease, but are those error bars when they overlap?
Yeah.
So when error bars overlap, does that mean that they're not significant? Yeah, sorry.
No, it's a very, very fair question. We had to do quite a lot of complicated modelling, so we sort of ended up having to sort of nest the limb within the horse, within the community, within Jaipur. So what I've sort of done there is fused two bits of information to try and make it visible, because if I just sort of put the output of the model, it would have meant very little. So it's a very reasonable question, and I think I'd tag onto that this issue of the control communities showing a reduction in lameness at the same time, which just didn't quite reach significance. And it's amazing that just simply having an interaction with the community and showing interest in a problem brings about change within itself, which I think is something we experience in all sorts of different interventions that we try to run, and it's also a sort of important part of trying to figure out how we manage and evaluate interventions that we carry out. But that was a very good question.